Hello, I'm Paul Shaker of Your Education Matters, an outreach of BC's Engaged University, Simon Fraser University. We are extending our reporting on BC education by a series of videos and podcasts on the issue of public school funding. You can find us on the web at youreducationmatters.ca. Tonight we are visiting the Parents Advocacy Network Forum at Douglas Elementary School in Vancouver. Our keynote speaker is Alex Hemingway of the Canadian Council on Policy Alternatives, who is reporting on his original research on the issue of BC's public school funding. A summary of Alex's work has appeared in the Vancouver Sun. There will be an interaction with PANVancouver officials and the audience as we explore an issue at the top of BC citizens' priorities. Watch social media for podcasts and videos from Your Education Matters.
Thanks everyone for being here tonight. As Alicia mentioned, I'm with the CCPA, Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. We're the leading progressive research institute in Canada, independent nonprofit public policy institute. Our research and publications and educational activities support the efforts of individuals and organizations working towards social, economic, and environmental justice. If you find our work helpful, you might want to follow us. I've got some information up here on the slide. There's also a sign-up sheet on the table outside. If you want to get on our email list for our work relating to public policy in BC, you could just pull out your phone right now and go to policyalternatives.ca/BC email, which you see up on the slide there. And as Alicia mentioned or alluded to, we've just published a new report on education funding in BC, the situation that we're facing, and it's called What's the Real Story Behind BC's Education Funding Crisis. There are some copies of that outside on the table as well, and you can find it online. Now, to the casual observer, the BC education funding debate has, I think, been a bit hard to follow, genuinely. We hear, on the one hand, from our provincial government, that funding for education in this province is at record levels, often pointing the finger at local school boards as the culprits for any sort of school closures or other cutbacks. And in fact, in the Minister of Education's mandate letter from the Premier, she begins by instructing him to control spending in education, as if the educational budget were on the cusp of ballooning out of control. Yet at the same time, I think what a lot of folks in this room have seen on the ground is that, first of all, at least half of the province's school districts have faced budget crises this spring, forced to make very difficult trade-offs between either shutting schools or cutting vital programs and supports. Meanwhile, the education system has continued to rely on parents to fundraise for things as basic as playgrounds, classroom technology. Teachers continue to subsidize school funding by paying large sums out of pocket for classroom supplies. And I think perhaps most concerning of all, class sizes have grown and classrooms host an increasing number of students with learning challenges and other special needs. So it's fair to ask for parents, for citizens, what's really going on here between these two narratives? How can we make sense of claims of record funding on the one hand and the observed reality on the ground on the other hand? Well, to understand the funding crisis that we've seen in BC's school districts, it's important to look at the big picture. So how much have we as a society prioritized public education in recent years? Could we afford major reinvestment in the system if we want it? Arguably, the best way to understand what we can afford to invest in public education is to look at BC's overall economic pie to see how much of it we invest in the education system, and that's the figure you're looking at on the screen now. When we do that, we see a significant drop in the share of our total economic resources dedicated to public education. So K-12 funding has actually fallen steadily from 3.3% of our province's gross domestic product in 2001 to about 2.5% in budget 2016. That's a 25% decline. And if we look only at the actual operating grants that are sent to school boards, so if we exclude things like capital cost and the cost of running the Ministry of Education itself, the drop is just as sharp, falling from 2.8% of GDP to 1.9% over that same period, those 15 years. Now, what does that mean in concrete terms? The critical thing to understand is these numbers are not small potatoes by any stretch. So a 0.9% decline in the share of GDP going to education actually represents about $2 billion. That's billion with a B, to be clear. But we can come back to that a little bit later. Viewed from another angle, BC has the second lowest public education funding in the country, nearly $1,000 below the national average, according to the most recent Statistics Canada data. And to top it off, hundreds of millions of dollars of taxpayer money are diverted each year into the private school sector. So that's that interprovincial comparison right there. You can see BC down on the low end. So how can, in this context, the government say that education funding is at record levels when the numbers seem to suggest otherwise that I've presented to you? Well, in fairness to them, it's technically true that the raw number of dollars going into the education system in BC has risen. The problem is that figure means very little, and anyone who deals in these sorts of numbers knows why. So, for example, I myself have spent record levels of money this year on rent and groceries, but I don't live in a bigger apartment and I'm not eating lobster for dinner. We know that inflation hits us every year. The real question is whether spending is keeping up with a few things, that basic inflation rate, most obviously, but also, very importantly, a whole range of additional cost pressures that have been downloaded from the provincial government to local school districts. And finally, by the way, and I think this often gets missed, we also want to account for the kinds of additional new investments we may want to make to enhance the overall quality of our education system. We shouldn't necessarily assume we just want to maintain where we're at. We may want to enhance the system, understanding how important education is. Now, in terms of those cost pressures I mentioned, over and above inflation, we've seen a doubling of MSP premiums since 2001, which we're all familiar with on a personal level. That also hits the budgets of our school districts. We've seen a 60% increase in BC Hydro rates since 2008. We've seen WorkSafe BC rates go up, the carbon tax, as well as costs like provincially mandated computer network upgrades. Now, these may all be, or in many cases, these may be legitimate costs, but the problem is when costs are increased without enough compensating dollars flowing into school districts, the system, of course, is left under enormous fiscal pressure. And, you know, according to an estimate released in government documents under Freedom of Information, these cost pressures that I've mentioned on school districts amount to a province-wide total of $192 million over the 2012 to 2014-15 school years. So it's quite significant. And in fact, you can even simply ask the legislature's own Standing Committee on Finance and Government Services, which examines the state of government finances each year and the state of public services. And this is not an opposition-led committee. The majority of its members are from the governing party. And in its recommendation, this government committee recognizes, legislative committee recognizes, and I'm quoting from their report here, additional funding is necessary to ensure the provision of quality public education and to properly meet the increased costs that schools are currently facing here in BC. So from all these different angles, I think in addition to our own experience on the ground, we can see that the system is under pressure. And the claims of highest funding ever are not what they seem. They should be taken with a very large grain of salt for the reasons I've mentioned. Now, unfortunately, in the public and in media, the provincial government has used, I hesitate to use the phrase, but I think it's fair to say sleight of hand to try and obscure this basic reality that we all see. So besides ignoring inflation and cost pressures, government sometimes points to a decline in overall school enrollment in BC as a reason for the situation we're in. But the funding crunch has hit school districts with increasing and declining enrollments. And by the way, province-wide, the government's own data show that enrollment is back on the rise, as you've probably heard in the news over the past couple of days, and the projection is for an increase of enrollment of 40,000 students by 2024. But the enrollment issue is also a red herring for a reason that's more fundamental. So imagine if you have a grade 5 classroom in an elementary school, in a community school. Now, suppose that class shrinks by 2 students in a given year. Now, in that circumstance, thousands and thousands of dollars of funding will be clawed back from the school under our per-student funding model. But of course, the cost of running that classroom hasn't changed, nor has the cost of lighting and heating the school. And in fact, an internal government memo from 2002 shows that the then new government recognized the shift that they were making in bringing in the per-student funding model, and that how it would actually help them deflect criticism of the government. This is something that journalist Michael Smith reported on at the time. And I'm just going to read to you a little excerpt from the memo, which explains that without the new changes to the funding model, quote, the province will be seen as responsible for all costs. With flat funding and rising costs, this option would require the minister to decide annually which programs and services should be cut throughout the province. Responsibility for reductions will thus rest with the ministry, not the local school board. So in other words, the old funding model actually required government to wear the blame for service cuts it may have imposed. But under the new funding model, cuts can be laid at the feet of local school boards, as we've seen recently. Now, there's much to say about all this. Maybe in the Q&A we can talk about the issue of 95% utilization targets in schools, as well as some of the more sometimes misleading funding announcements and re-announcements we've seen this spring. But moving forward, I think it's critical to recognize that there's really no question that BC can afford to reinvest in public education if we choose. So this year alone, the provincial government declared a $730 million surplus and put away another $300 million in a prosperity fund, and it also sent $310 million in public tax dollars to private schools, a practice which is opposed by 3/4 of British Columbians, according to recent polling cited in the report. Now, as I mentioned a little earlier, if we dedicated simply the same share of our total economic pie to public education as we did 15 years ago, we'd have another $2 billion at hand to invest in the system. Now, that level of additional funding may go beyond what's needed. That's a question of priorities we can ask ourselves, but it tells us what's in the realm of the possible when we're told that we have to tighten our belts and the money isn't there. And in a way, I think it's very strange to have to make the case for adequate investment in public education. We know that a strong public education system is not just nice to have, it's an essential long-term investment that pays big social and economic dividends. And we also know from the education research that investing resources in things like reducing class sizes substantially improves outcomes for students and helps disadvantaged students the most. And in a province where we've seen persistent poverty, we've seen growing inequality, education is one of those great remaining equalizers. It's very important in that sense. We also know that kids with special needs and learning challenges deserve and benefit from getting classroom support, and yet the number of BC classes with 4 or more students with special needs has increased dramatically over the past 10 years, almost doubled, without the needed level of support for those students. Now, I would just close these comments by noting that while we're talking here about education, this is not only an education story. There's a broader context that I think can help us understand the situation. Look, my job at the CCPA is to look at the overall state of public finance and public services in BC, and it's important to see that in the same period that we've seen a decline in public education spending as a share of our total economic pie, we've also seen, in fact, our whole public sphere shrink as a share of the economy. And that's not an accident. That's specifically a consequence of public policies like tax cuts that have delivered the biggest bang to the richest British Columbians, in the process reducing the capacity to publicly make investments in areas like education. And in fact, to make it a bit more concrete, what these tax cuts have looked like, households in BC's top 1% now pay an extraordinary $41,000 less in tax per year than they did in 2001. The truth is, we can afford to invest substantially more in public education in BC, but currently we, or our government and policymakers, choose not to. But that's always been a choice, it remains a choice, and organized citizens can have something to say about all this, so it's up to us.